Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz, and I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore. And I'm thrilled today to welcome Keith Ridgway to celebrate his new novel, A Shock, in conversation with John Keene. While the pandemic has taken a toll on all of our lives, events like the one that you're about to see have become bright spots in our days. And I want to give a special thank you to our guests for joining us this evening. So to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We'll be asking those at the end of our program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat button through which I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, very important. And one caveat for tonight's event is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise, and we'll try to resolve them as quickly as possible. And we've scheduled a whole host of summer programming for you. So do head over to our website, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is tomorrow, July 8th, we are thrilled to be collaborating again with our friends at Harvard Bookstore to welcome Michael Pollan for the release of his new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, which is a radical challenge to how we think about drugs, in conversation with NPR's Alex Spiegel. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. And finally, we've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. So now a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Keith Ridgway was born in Dublin. Penelope Fitzgerald declared his writing, quote, 100 times worth reading. Ridgway's novel Hawthorn Child has been acclaimed as, quote, breathtakingly unpredictable and unapologetically strange in The Guardian, brilliantly weird by Ian Rankin, and vibrant, wonderfully funny, deeply troubled, effortlessly lyrical, extraordinary by Eileen Battersby in the Irish Times. He has won the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, the O. Henry Award, the Prix Féminin Étranger, and the Premier Roman Étranger. John Keene was born in St. Louis. He's the author of Annotations and Counter-Narratives, both published by New Directions, as well as several other works, including the poetry collection Seismosis with artist Christopher Stackhouse, and a translation of Brazilian author Hilda Hilst's novel, Letters from a Seducer. Keene is the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including the MacArthur Genius Award, the Wyndham Campbell Prize, and the Whiting Foundation Prize for Fiction. He teaches at Rutgers University, Newark. So without any further ado, I'll let you both take it away. Thanks so much, Keith and John.
Wonderful. Thank you, Noah. So I thought to launch this wonderful event, first of all, it's incredible to be in conversation with you and to celebrate your amazing new book, your amazing new novel, to have you maybe read a little bit so we can get your language in our head.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you, John. Thank you, Noah. It's lovely to be joining you. I'm going to read from the first chapter of the book to start off with. This is about a woman, an older woman who lives on her own, a widow. And the house next door, they're having a party. When she wakes, the party has started and she cannot move. It takes her a little while to fully realize anything. The room is dim, as if forgotten. Her body has settled and failed. She is dead. Then she breathes and blinks her eyes and breathes again and again. She has slept for far too long, a couple of hours maybe, and is confused and frightened, though she is also, as she begins to understand the situation, still alive and still herself. And this is the room where she sleeps and has slept for most of her life. Various incorrect ideas about what is happening fall away from her and are immediately lost as she closes in on the truth, remembers who is dead, who lives next door now, who is having a party, that this is the party, that it has started, that what she is hearing is laughter and voices, and they are not in her house, they are next door, and that she cannot hear any music. She lies there, confused, still frightened, in a paralyzed grip, the grip of everything which feels about to fall apart in her life, her diminishing life. And why is there no music? But she is not paralyzed. She raises her head. The cat is curled up beside her, but is also confused and stares at her. She strokes the cat and they make stupid noises at each other. Then the music starts up. She freezes. My God. It has probably started up not for the first time, but again. It is a throb and a pressure. The cat jumps off the bed and onto the wardrobe shelf and burrows into cardigans. She usually forbids that, but now she lets it happen. She might climb in there too. She might. This is awful. It occurs to her that perhaps the music stopping was what had woken her. Perhaps she could have slept all the way through it if the music hadn't stopped. Her dream had been something sharp, but it has fled now. She could go out. It's too late. There would be nowhere open, nowhere for her. She could just walk. She eases herself off the bed and stands up. The cat watches her. She's stiff and her mouth is dry, and she thinks she'll brush her teeth, find her earplugs. When she turns to leave, the cat makes a furious protest, then leaps out to join her. She walks along the corridor in the gloom, not daring to turn on any lights, to the bathroom, wary of the wall, imagining that it is bulging with sound like the skin of a drum, though of course it is doing nothing of the sort. But this is so loud. She's still half asleep and she knows that she is, but this is so loud. This is not what she had expected. Surely it can't be this loud. The cat is mewling behind her, following her all the way to the bathroom, and she splashes her face and brushes her teeth and rummages in the drawer for her earplugs, which are many years old. And all the while there is the throb of next door at her back, a boom and press of bass, like a heat against the wall, like a fire. And sometimes the haze, the flick of other things on top of it, singing and instruments and melody, things jumping and spitting on a pan. And the voices, all the voices boiling together, people having to shout to make themselves heard, shouting out. And you might think that they're dying in there if it was not for the laughter, the huge bursts of laughter that come every few seconds, which punch through the wall as if directed at her personally. She stands in the bathroom, staring astonished at her own face in the mirror, and just listens, the cat at her legs.
It's amazing to hear your voice bringing those words to life, because they have such a force, they come alive when you read them on the page. So it made me think of a lot of things, but I'll start with a very basic question, which is one of the things that struck me reading this book was that on the one hand, when I first started reading it, I was thinking this is a collection of very interesting and innovative stories. And then by the middle of the book, what becomes clear is that this is a novel, right? I think at one point I might have even, referred to it to the directions when I was, kind of in conversation with them about it, as a novel in stories. And I maybe even said that in my little blurb, but it's not exactly, there's stories that could, in a sense, stand on their own, but it is also clearly a novel. Could you talk a little bit about, the kind of tension between the individual stories and this collective story, and also about this, which is, and we'll talk about this, I hope, a little bit, the fascinating construction, the way that you link these stories or these chapters that feel like individual stories up so that you get this feeling of, by the end, of completion, of fullness, but also they nevertheless feel very distinct, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and people have read this book and have talked about it as stories. Mm-hmm. I think what happens is as you describe it, you begin to read it and you think, okay, this is a collection of stories. This is interesting. But then at some point, at some stage, maybe a third of the way in or something, you realize, no, this is something else. It's very much a novel to me. It was conceived as a whole thing. It was written all at once. I was writing bits of it that are in various parts of the book all at the same time. So it's very much a novel to me, but I completely understand how people feel that it's like a collection of stories, but it's doing something else. I think part of the reason for this is that I think I have a very relaxed view of what constitutes a novel and what constitutes a collection. I was thinking during the week, actually, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and I was beginning to read, particularly literature in translation from Eastern Europe, I read a few collections of short stories thinking that they were novels. So I remember reading The Street of Crocodiles, Bruno Schulz's collection of stories, and I thought it was a novel. And I think there was a Kafka collection, maybe Country Doctor as well. And I had the same, that was the way I read it. I mean, I don't quite know what that means, because you read things just, whether you're reading a story or a novel, you read in the same way. But in my mind, I was thinking, these are novels. Okay, this is what a novel can be like. And I've continued to kind of have that relaxed attitude. When I read Counter Narratives, John, I kind of thought, I read it like it was a novel. It feels to me like a complete book. Do you know what I mean? In which although it follows a chronology, bits of it are talking to other bits of it all the time. And so when I think of Counter Narratives, I think of it as very much as a whole book, a whole singular thing, even though I know it's made up of, I guess, what you could call detachable fictions. And some of the chapters in A Shock are detachable in that sense. And some of them make sense on their own, but some of them won't. Some of them, there'll be things in there that just need the other things in order to make sense of them. And I think when they're taken out of it, they're a little less than when they're embedded in it. So I think of it very much as a novel, but a strange kind of novel, I suppose.
Right. Well, this is a very sort of, I think, kind of nerdy craft question. But I mean, so one of the components that really makes A Shock feel like a novel is what I would call this kind of inner, these kind of inner ligaments, these really sort of interesting and sometimes hidden connections that you don't expect, but that pop up, and then you say, and of course it mentally takes you back to a prior story, or then of course you're sort of imagining, is there going to be something here that I'm reading that sort of reappears later on? Were you thinking about that consciously, or did that sort of evolve, use this word, organically, right? I mean, how does that, in terms of conceptualizing how everything was fitting together? Was it just a process of writing it and then figuring things out, or did you have a kind of design before the fact?
I tend to write my way into things and write my way through things, and then have to write my way out of things without any kind of concept. Certainly, I don't go into it with a plan or with an idea of certain things that I want to do. I think what happens often is that I'm writing in a kind of fog, and I'm not paying too much attention to things that are recurring, that just happen to recur because they're in my head. And when I get it down on paper, I decide, okay, these are all the things that I want to be in this book. I've got them down on paper in some form. I then go through it and I notice those things, the things that recur, the things that I keep coming back to, the things that thematically are the same or are linked in some ways. And some of them, I think, that's too much, that's too on the nose, it's too silly, it's you're just saying the same thing again, so they come out. But some of them, they work. And it's just a matter of kind of feeling my way through it. Certainly there's no plan beforehand, and there's no real concept at all.
Okay, so it's not sort of, I guess, David Mitchell concept or sort of approach where it's like you really map all these things out, and then you think,
no, my head isn't big enough to do that. I can only fit so much in there.
Well, you nevertheless, you created a marvelous text here. So I was thinking about this first section that you read from, and this character, and I was thinking, I mean, this is a character who's in so many ways very marginal. I mean, when you began reading, you one of the sort of, I think, fascinating moments where in this story where this character is basically, in a sense, almost dead, right? She's and she's not even sure. So, the reader isn't sure. I mean, is this a living person? Is this a ghost? But her existence is in some ways very ghostly. Though we do come to see that, she of course has this cat and she's moving throughout her day and she's lost, I believe her husband, and she's got these very interesting neighbors. I think it's I can't remember the couple or roommate, right? The couple, and who live next door and they're having this fascinating party. And the so on a certain level, she's very fascinated by them and by the world outside. But on the other hand, she's really kind of cut off. And I was thinking about in the collection, what comes up through again and again is the sort of marginality on a certain level of these characters,
Right.
but you show repeatedly how they're connected. And I was thinking, in some ways, it's felt like this character in particular reminded me, although she's an older version of, the protagonist of Joyce's Araby, who's basically just whose life is just sort of shut down. But then, and she's like, looking out on the avenue, and she missed her chance to kind of get away. But then, and of course, I'm also thinking about this, that long tradition of, British working class fiction, Irish working class fiction. But then you also, there is this experimental element, this element that is kind of taking us to a different place. Because you talk about, these characters and what led you to write about the people who populate this book, right? Who are all around us, and yet so often we don't see them or see them written about in fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in, I suppose, writing a novel about people who don't get novels written about them, right? And these are characters who, there's nothing particularly novelistic happening to any one of these characters in the course of the book. Journeys, they're not moving through arcs, they're not developing, I'm not interested in any of that. What I am interested in is just these people in their quite particular London lives, contemporary kind of London lives, and the way in which they struggle in that. And that marginality that you pick up on, yeah, that's absolutely there. But it's kind of there by default. I don't have to write it into it. These are just, this is the way people live. But the connection stuff that you also pick up on, I definitely wanted to write that into it. I didn't just want to write a kind of depressing, realistic book about marginal London lives. I wanted to write a realistic book about marginal London lives and the way in which those lives are funny, the way in which they can be joyous, the way in which at times and moments, even if it's only for moments, they can be connected to other people, and ways in which they experience that connection. And that can be incredibly fleeting. And sometimes it can even be based on a sort of a false premise, a kind of deceit, but nevertheless, it's a connection. And that becomes usually important in lives like these, I think. And that's what I was interested in trying to capture, trying to write about.
Well, that sort of reminds me that you mentioned, there's a lot of humor. You, pardon me, I think repeatedly surprised the reader in terms of, because these aren't stories with, heavy plots, but they go in very interesting and unexpected directions. And so even with this first story, so I'm not gonna give away the goods, but I will say that there is a very strange thing that happens involving this woman. I was actually kind of, let's put it literally, I was shocked by what she does, right? And so that leads me to the title. How do you see, I think there's a way in which, the shock, the kind of the metaphor of the shock in a very literal sense, very direct sense, not so much figurative, but literal sense, there are these like little shocks or pulsations that happen in these characters' lives, right? And then sort of across the novel as a whole. How did you see that operating, this idea of a shock or the shock? And what does it mean in terms of the meaning of the novel to you? Or how would you interpret it?
It's one of those, as you know, as we were saying a few minutes ago, it's one of those things that on reading through the book myself, having gotten most of it down on paper, it's one of those things that sort of, this word keeps on reappearing. It's shock, this notion of a shock. And I think it's about this woman in the first chapter is kind of, she doesn't quite know it, but she's desperate for some sort of connection with somebody, really desperate, in a kind of terribly sad sort of way, but she just really needs to make contact with somebody. And at the same time is terrified of doing that, because she thinks, why would anyone want to have any kind of connection with me? I'm not worth connecting with. My story is not worth the telling. And so when those connections happen, they can come as a kind of shock, I think. So I was interested in that. And there's also one of the characters mentions that her grandfather used to wish people, I don't know where I got this, I assume I made it up. Her grandfather used to wish people, say to people, may your death come as a shock to you. Meaning, I hope it happens quickly and you don't suffer, and it's not a lingering, painful thing. I hope it comes like that. But it's a strange thing to say to somebody, may your death come as a shock to you. And so I was interested in that. And the idea of a shock was kind of playing around. But shocks can be positive things. Shocks can, as well as being negative things. Sometimes people who are in one way or another trapped in the circumstances of their lives, or in habits that they've got into, or kind of cul-de-sacs or dead ends that they've got into, a shock can get them out of that kind of place sometimes. So all that kind of stuff is happening, and happens throughout the book, really, in lots of different ways. And it just presented itself as a title. I'm not even sure at what stage it presented itself as a title. I think quite early on, I think. So yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, shock. I mean, one of the things that seems to happen, again, is people are shocked out of their complacency, or out of, the very sort of quotidian aspects of their life. Why don't we, if you're game for it, why don't we hear another section of the book? That'd be great.
Oh, that's nicely done, because I know the part you mean now. Yeah, this is talking about shocks. This is a section in the middle of the book, chapter in which our hero for this part of the book, Tommy, he's in an Uber, in a taxi with his friend Frank, and they're both quite high, so they're in that kind of weird headspace. Is this bad traffic? Asked Tommy. We haven't moved. Have we moved? We're in the same place, said Frank. It's not so bad, said the driver. We're nearly there. Frank turned to Tommy and lowered his voice. We're in the same place. Will it be a happy gathering? Tommy asked the driver. I mean, your family gathering, because some aren't necessarily, Oh yes, we are a very happy family. Oh, that's marvelous, said Frank. Happiness is lovely to come across, Tommy said. You burst into it, like you're crawling in a tunnel, and suddenly it opens out into this wonderful great space. Cavers talk about it, people who, what are they called? They go down into the deep, deep cave systems, tiny little tunnels, barely the width of their bodies, and they have to squeeze through, pressed down by all that rock. Terrifies me, even the thought of it, a mile of rock pressing down on your back, and under your belly there's nothing but the earth, the whole planet, all the way down, all through the fire, and you're pressed against it, and there's nothing at all between you and nothing, because you touch all the sides of this space, and sometimes it is actually literally like that. Not only are they crawling, they're actually sort of dragging themselves, shuffling through what is effectively a tube, because we think of these tunnels pressing on the back and the belly, but they press on the sides of the body as well. So often they will have their arms straight out ahead of themselves, and they will operate like climbers operate, finding handholds, grips, by which they can pull themselves forward, pull themselves through inch by inch. And if they're lucky, there's enough room for them to bend their legs and find a toe hold and push themselves forward as well. Because every part of them, every part of their body, from the shoulders to their hips, is pressed into the earth, pressed by the earth. They're buried in it, embedded, and they usually have a rope tied to one foot, their left probably, in case they become stuck and they can be pulled back. And this must always be in their minds, this idea of just getting stuck, of pushing forwards and kicking forward and feeling perhaps their shoulders or their hips simply sticking, jamming, like a piece of wood you stick into a wall or something, or maybe even their head. They misjudge the gap in front of them and they push, maybe with their leg, maybe they have a good toe hold for once. So they dig their foot in and they give themselves a decent shove forwards, but they misjudge the gap and it's their head that gets stuck, gets jammed. Think of the terror of that. For me anyway, that would be so completely terrifying that your neck cannot move your head. You can't look any way other than the way you happen to be facing. You cannot move. Your head is in a vice, and the vice is the planet. Imagine that. Imagine the terror of that. My God. Though, of course, these people who do this, these cave crawlers in the dark, they don't feel anything like that. It's a minor inconvenience for them. For one thing, it's not their head, it's their helmet that's stuck. They don't do this sort of thing without helmets. And all the safety equipment that they need, they're not stupid. This isn't some sort of weird death drive that makes them do this. And if they get their helmet stuck, they just ease themselves out of it briefly, maybe shuffle back a little, and they ease themselves out of their helmet so that it's stuck there, a piece of hard-shaped plastic stuck in the planet, like a piece of wood stuck in a wall, like the point of a nail driven into the wall is one way of thinking about it. And they push back so that they can get a better grip of their helmet and yank it out. And maybe that means they have to go back. That particular tunnel is just too small, too narrow, too constricted. So maybe they go back, or maybe if it's safe, they chisel away at the little bit of rock that's blocking the way, because sometimes it isn't that the tunnel is narrowing, it's just that there is an obstacle there and they can remove it or get past it somehow. Or maybe their helmet doesn't get stuck. Maybe the tunnel is incredibly narrow, but they can get through it. And they probably have torn clothes, ripped clothes, and fingers that are ripped and legs that are cut and ripped as well. And they probably have bruises on their arms and their legs, blood may be running from wounds on their back, from wounds in their chest. They may be covered in sweat, even if it's cold down there, even if it's in the dark, cold depths. So deep they are steaming. They give off a steam of heat and exertion, and they pull and push and bleed, and then suddenly the tunnel bursts open into a huge and beautiful cavern, like a train station, like a cathedral, like a city under the ground, a huge, empty, beautiful space. And they burst onto this suddenly with a beautiful shock, and something which they had forgotten, something which maybe in their spirit they had forgotten, space and simple freedom, something which, no matter how professional and apparently fearless these people are, don't tell me that they would not have begun in those tunnels no bigger than themselves. Don't tell me that they wouldn't have begun to suspect that there was nothing other than themselves, nothing else at all. And suddenly, with a gasp, with a loud gasp of pure amazement, they would see, as if creation itself had happened again, as if the Big Bang had happened again, suddenly this expansion, this huge and sudden rushing apart of matter. And they would be in a new world, a new universe, in which they can see for millions of miles, not miles, for a long way, over rocks and cliffs and streams and lakes, a whole amazing openness in which they can breathe, where they can look and keep looking, in which they can rest and stop moving. The taxi turned left between oncoming cars, and there was a pleasant roll to the movement, and Tommy rolled into Frank, and Frank rolled with him just a little. "Yes, it is," said Frank, but Tommy didn't know what he meant. The driver looked in the mirror at Tommy. Tommy looked away. "What I don't understand," Frank said, "is how, Sammy, are we nearly there yet?" asked Tommy. "Yes, we're nearly there." "What time is it?" The driver looked at him again, but said nothing. Frank looked at his wrist, but there was no watch there. He had his phone in his hand. Nobody knows, he said. Nobody knows.
Wow. I mean, one of the things I was thinking, again, hearing you read it, first that starts off almost like it reminded me of, maybe Thomas Bernhard, this gathering, onrush of words of description, sort of taking us in a particular direction, but you end up in a very different place. Someone like Bernhard. And there's again and again in this book, and I was thinking about this, for example, with Hawthorn Child. Let's pick up with Hawthorn Child, a kind of incredible uncanniness, that you achieve over and over. A kind of, people in Noah's introduction, he mentioned the strangeness, right? But it's the strangeness in the best way, right? Strangeness that you repeatedly end up in a place that you don't expect. Could you talk about that and just how in your writing, maybe if you don't want to describe how you achieve it, just as a writer, do you feel it when it happens, or is it also a kind of surprise or shock to you when you go back and reread? This just the very fascinating places that your narrative goes, right?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer, really, because I think for me there's a lot less strangeness in my writing for me than there seems to be for readers often, and that's fine. I'm absolutely I'm completely relaxed about that. I don't at all mind when people describe the books as strange, or as particular passages or whatever in the books as strange or weird or unsettling or whatever, because I like that. I want to do something to the reader. I want them to feel something. So I'm relaxed about that. But it's not as if I'm striving for strangeness in what I write. It's not that. I guess I have a way of trying to write about character, which to me feels kind of real. And in order to do that, I spend a lot of time just imagining myself into the heads of these people who are often very, very different to me. Sometimes they're quite similar to me, but often very different. And whichever way it is, it becomes an act of the imagination, really. And the kind of writing, such as the passage I just read, comes out of that. It feels sometimes like I'm an actor, or like I've sort of occupied somebody's point of view or somebody's state of mind for a moment. And at that time, it comes very easily to me. Like that piece that I just read would have been written very quickly, as it is now. Kind of, it would have sort of just spilled out, but only after a long period of sort of imagining myself into that guy's head and into that guy's head in that situation, and just allowing myself. And it helps, to be honest, writing a piece like that. The fact that he's high as a kite, so it's you can allow yourself just kind of go a bit crazy with it. And you can do that, and it seems okay. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, John. It seems to me that the strangeness stuff just happens to me. I'm not trying to be strange, but I own up to it. I hold my hands up. There is strangeness in these books, but I hope it's a recognizable strangeness, and it's a human strangeness, and that it's not a contrived strangeness, I hope.
Well, it's exhilarating, and that's why I also mentioned the word uncanny, because there's a kind of resonance or something that I feel. I felt reading this book and reading Hawthorn Child. These moments where it was almost like you were so close as the reader to something, and yet and it was like again, that feeling of you felt this something before, and it kind of returns back to you, with a kind of just very sort of a fascinating emotional, power. And I think you achieve that again and again. So it's the best kind of, that's what I'm saying, the best kind of strangeness, the best kind of uncanniness. We actually have a number of questions here. So let's see. I'll pose some of them to you, and
Okay.
what do you have to say? The first one is, Hawthorn Child reminded me of the writing of Harold Pinter. Was he an influence on your writing?
I like Harold Pinter, but I have to say I wouldn't know Harold Pinter's work particularly well, I don't think. But certainly I would have, over the years, I would have seen various productions of Harold Pinter things. I saw a great production of The Caretaker once in London with Michael Gambon, which was fantastic. But he might be one of those writers that, is there in the back of my head somehow and has filtered his way through, but not consciously. If you'd asked me for a list of, please don't ask me, but if somebody asked me for a list of writers that were influences, I don't think it would have occurred to me to put him on it. But that's a nice reminder for someone to have. I'm very flattered by that. So if you detect some Harold Pinter in my writing, then I'll take that. That's good.
And you handle dialogue so masterfully. So I think that also might have provoked that question. Yeah.
Okay.
Here's another one. Your work is clearly well loved in the States and across the Atlantic, including France, apparently. Exclamation point. Do you find any differences in the reactions or reception your books have gotten in different countries? Has anything surprised you?
Everything surprises me. I'm constantly surprised at the receptions that the books get in there. I mean, I'm not sure that I can pick out sort of distinctive national kind of reactions to things. I think it's wonderful when people react positively to a book or to a piece of writing, no matter where they are. And obviously, it's always a great thing when that happens. And I'm not sure that I can pick out sort of distinctive differences. In France, they were very keen on me very early on in my career. I think they're far less keen on me now. I don't think they like the turn that I've taken in recent years, and they want the old young Keith Ridgway to come back writing sort of rural Gothic Irish novels. They're not so keen on the current stuff. But anyway, apart from that, there's reactions in different countries are great. But it's almost 10 years since I published Hawthorn Child, and I had forgotten, to be honest, how strange and how weird the process of publication is, and how for me, I'd forgotten how anxious it makes me, and how kind of exposed I feel when a book has just come out, And it's that stupid sort of double think of on the one hand, this is very exciting, everyone is reading my book, or people are reading my book. And on the other hand, this is terrifying, people are reading my book. It's both things at the same time. And there's this period, the initial period after publication, where you're being noticed and read by and judged by your peers, by other writers and by reviewers, etc. I find it really difficult. Really, I don't enjoy it. But I know from the way it's gone in the past that after a few months, all that settles down, and then you begin to hear from readers, and that's wonderful, and that's always really good. Even when some of the letters or emails can be kind of, I enjoyed your book, Mr. Ridgway. However, even those I really like them, because they're just the real reactions to things. And so I'm looking forward to getting past this sort of initial publication bit, which I find quite difficult actually, and getting into the sort of calmer waters of post-publication.
Well, I have to say, you read as if you are, you're not feeling any nerves at all, which is wonderful. Let me ask you a question that I mentioned before. I know after, or at least I've read that after Hawthorn Child, you had decided to stop writing. And then but I know you published several things after that. And then you wrote this beautiful novel. So can you talk a little bit about what led to, if you're willing to, it led to the decision to stop, and then what brought you back to writing?
Yeah, it's actually, it's not, I wish there was an interesting answer. There isn't. I finished Hawthorn Child, and I did what, as a writer I'm supposed to do. I started a new project, but it didn't go very well. And so after maybe a year or so, I shelved it and I moved on to something else, but that didn't go very well either. And I just thought, I don't like what I'm doing. I don't like the work I'm doing. It's not very good. I'll take a break. And I decided just to stop and not write anything. And I thought maybe that would last, I don't know, a year, and that would be good for me, a little holiday from it. And then before I knew what had happened, about 3 or 4 years had gone by. And I suddenly thought, okay, I'm not a writer anymore, obviously. This is that phase of my life is over. And I even went as far as telling people, Barbara Eppler, New Directions, I told her, Barbara, I've retired, I said. And she kind of said, okay, whatever, and continued very gently, every sort of 6 months or so, she would send me a little email, sort of, you still retired? But I had felt that I'd given it up, that I'd stopped. But then something weird happened, which is that having stopped writing, after a while I stopped reading. Mm-hmm. And then I suddenly noticed I hadn't read anything in a while. And I didn't like that, because reading has been a huge part of my life, a hugely important part of my life. But I found that suddenly I wasn't reading anymore. I couldn't read, couldn't pick up books. So I wanted to fix that. So I kind of in a very determined manner, I kind of set about starting to read again. And that was successful. And as I read more and more and more, suddenly the desire to write came back to me. And I think it's always been the case with me, that the desire to write has come out of my love of reading. It's through reading great books and by great writers that it enthuses me. It makes me want to write. And so having reversed out of writing, I reversed too far and reversed out of reading as well, and then went back into reading, and then found a new desire for writing. So I just began thinking about it, and then the idea of this novel came into my head, and then I started putting it down on paper, and then I had to write that embarrassing email to Barbara saying, actually, I haven't retired at all, which is great. But it was lovely to have people like Barbara and Philip Gwyn Jones, who's a publisher here in the UK, who were, they were nagging me, but it was a very gentle and sort of constructive nagging. And it was lovely to have people to remind me that, I'm a writer, that's what I do, and I should get back to it. And that's where I am now.
We're ever the more thankful that you did read and then begin writing. So why don't we do? So we have a few more questions, but why don't we hear like another little snippet, and then I'll ask, if we have time, ask these questions, because there's several.
Another reading? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. This is a very brief one. It's from a chapter called "The Story." It's a woman in a pub telling her friend a story. There's a story that my grandfather used to tell me. He had been a sailor on trawlers first off Brittany, battling the Atlantic, though he didn't like fish. Then on cargo vessels all over the world. Then finally, unhappily, on a ferry a ferry on the Channel. He liked being on the sea, but he loved to be on the ocean. He thought the ocean was the stuff of the planet itself, and he was in awe of it, and it nourished him. Land was small and dreary and cut up, and he seemed genuinely to not understand how anybody could accept that a border was a real thing. It was an absurdity. He railed against borders, stupid doodles on the world. Anyway, the story he told me was about a border. He was helping some people cross it. The details were always vague. A small boat, a foggy, becalmed sea, a group of frightened refugees or fugitives approaching the coast in complete silence, waiting for the sound of a bell to guide them to safety. My grandfather was tense, standing up in the prow, not able to see the hand at the end of his outstretched arm. There was no bell. Someone whimpered and was quietened. A cough was smothered in gloved hands, the distant shush of a rippled beach. And then a single low tone, far off but clear, a bell. My grandfather turned his head and held his breath, and just as his lungs began to fail, it rang again. They made for it, navigating by ear, slightly to port, straight ahead, the encouraging bell. And then there was a second bell, another bell, a different one, a single low tone, far off but clear, slightly different to the first, a different direction, a different bell. Oars were lifted and the sailors huddled and conferred. My grandfather was new to this, but the others weren't, and they were in no doubt. They turned around. They headed back the way they'd come, carefully, slowly, grimly, shrugging off the increasingly desperate pleadings of their passengers. Not tonight, another night.
Again,
Yes.
you start one place and take us to another place. Wonderful. Okay, so I'll pose these questions because they speak directly to what you just read and what you were saying right before you read the excerpt. So I'm going to pair them. The first one is, what did you read while you were writing this book? Anything you purposely didn't read? And the second question is, what was your process like writing A Shock versus writing Hawthorn Child?
There was certainly nothing that I avoided reading. I know that some writers, because I've heard them talk about it, some writers have an anxiety of being influenced too much by something that they're reading. For some reason, I've never felt that anxiety. I've always been eager to read whatever I want to read while I'm working. And if great writers have any kind of influence or effect on my writing, then that's all to the good, right? It's something I would welcome. So there's nothing I avoided. Having said that, I'm not sure that there's anything particular. I think I was reading a lot of Clarice Lispector when I was writing this. And perhaps she found her way in there somehow. That would be nice to think that she did, but I couldn't exactly point out how or where. But I can't think of any particular others. I was reading a lot of Georges Simenon's Maigret books. I'm not sure, maybe they found their way in there as well. I mean, that whole thing about a bell and a foggy, becalmed sea, that's kind of something very Simenon about that. But I can't think of anything that was a direct influence on A Shock. In terms of the differences in process between Hawthorn Child and this, I have a terrible memory, and Hawthorn Child was a long time ago now, and I can't actually remember. I know that I wrote most of it in a cafe in North London, but apart from that, I can't, and I know that I didn't enjoy it. That's the one thing I can remember. I did not enjoy writing Hawthorn Child. I don't know if that comes across in the book, but I was kind of miserable when I was writing it. And it was very different writing a shock. I really enjoyed writing a shock. I was happy to get to my desk and get a few clear hours in which I could work at it. And I enjoyed that. So that there was a difference in that sense. But I can't remember what my kind of process or what sort of plan of attack I took in writing Hawthorn Child. I think it was slow, and I think it was kind of unhappy. And I think this was much quicker and happier.
Okay. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this goes to the writing of A Shock. And it's from John Pender. He says, Keith, I'm curious about your process of revising A Shock. Did it take you a lot of time to arrange and orchestrate the different sections? Or did things fall into place after a certain amount of writing? Thanks for your wonderful work.
Thank you. As I said earlier, the whole thing came to me as a sort of single idea. I wanted to write about these people, or a collection of people. And it's very geographical. It's all based around where I live here in South London, Camberwell, Peckham. So I was kind of wandering around the streets here, and I was sort of picking out locations and thinking, so-and-so lives there, and so-and-so lives there, and they drink here, and all that kind of stuff. And there were more characters and more chapters in the original idea. And some of them just got sort of shaved off at various times. But there was no, as I said to John earlier, there was no overall kind of plan that went, that I had worked out beforehand. I knew that I wanted to write a number of characters, maybe about a dozen, maybe 10 or so different sort of people, and ways in which their lives overlapped. And I knew ways in which that they would overlap. They would know each other. They would go to the same places. They would be involved in local politics, perhaps in the same way. And it just, in the writing of it, those things became clear and began to tie up in a satisfactory way, or they didn't, and were kind of shuffled off to the side. I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that probably does answer the question. And let me just add another kind of question to that, which was, were there things, as you were writing, were there things that you sort of, divined? Were there places that you went that surprised you as a writer? That were very unexpected, and you said, okay, well, somewhat unexpected or very unexpected, and you said to yourself, I'm going to keep this in the book because, I was not expecting to go to this place, or was it, I thought about this character, and maybe this is what I sort of envisioned for this character. Because again, these characters really come to life in very, very interesting ways. But then when we get these snippets of them reappearing or disappearing, it's fascinating to see the places you go.
There's one particular chapter in the book that took me by surprise, and it started as a kind of an experiment, really. It's a chapter called "The Flat." If I was American, it would have been called The Apartment. So it's about a young man who moves into a new flat. And I decided, I was having difficulty writing it. Mm-hmm. And I decided to take a step back from his perspective. I started writing it from his point of view, third person narrative voice, but from his point of view, from his perspective. And I found that wasn't working. So I took a step back and I changed the narrative voice. Still third person, but it was strictly detached, completely observational narrative voice. And I just watched what this guy does in his new home, and recorded the dialogue that he had with other people. Mm-hmm. And I thought I was just this was just an experiment for my own kind of benefit. I did not think it would end up in the book. But I really got into it. I really loved writing it. And I just couldn't quite stop. And there's something quite voyeuristic about it. And people have said it can be quite unsettling. And I found it voyeuristic as well. I just couldn't sort of turn away from watching this guy and watching what he does. And there's something wrong. There's something terribly wrong in where he's living or in his mind. And I was just fascinated by that. So that became quite a central part of the story of the novel. And that took me by surprise, I think. And him as a character took me by surprise.
Okay, wonderful. And actually, I said that was the last question, but we have a fascinating question that just popped up. So we'll make this the last one because we only have about 5 minutes. And it's by Dawn Dorland. And she says, in a multiracial setting like London, how do you handle craft-wise the introduction of the character's race? And I'd love to hear you talk about this because that's one of the fascinating things about Hawthorn and Child, when you learn, about the races of both Hawthorn and Child. But you do it in a very, I think, a very smooth and unexpected way. But anyway, how do you identify racially white characters?
That's really interesting. You're right. London is a very diverse, racially diverse city, and I think the kind of attitude that I've tried to adopt to doing this, and it is something that I've given a lot of thought to because I have to. Is that I don't identify people's race, and sometimes it'll just become obvious because it comes up in conversations between characters. Or there's a chapter in A Shock, for example, where it's a very important part between a relationship between two friends who've been friends since their school days. But there's a problem in the white guy's head, and they eventually come around to sort of addressing it. And there are other characters in A Shock who I know what race they are, but I don't think it's obvious in the book. And in Hawthorn and Child, it was the same sort of thing. Hawthorn is white, Child is black. They're partners, and it comes up in various ways and different times and things. But when I'm writing it, I've just got to allow that to happen and allow the characters to do it. And if I start sort of editorializing about any of that kind of stuff, I think it's awkward, and it becomes contrived and sort of strange. So I just try to let the characters be themselves, and I think that's kind of the attitude I take to it. But it's a really interesting question, and it's a tricky thing for me to think about. I'm an Irish guy, a white Irish guy living in London, from a very sort of monocultural, almost entirely white background and upbringing, and I'm now living in this city where I remain a kind of outsider, and I have to think quite hard about the ways in which I write about the city from the inside, as it were, which I try to do in this couple of books. So it's something that I give thought to, and I hope I've got it right, or got it close to right in this book.
Well, and I would say you do this is very interesting in the ways to think about the ways you write about sexuality as well, right?
Right.
Race and sexuality, right? Both are here and in your other work. So we're at, I think, the end of this wonderful event. So thank you so much, Keith. It was such a pleasure. Thank you, Community Bookstore. Thanks, New Directions, and thanks to everyone who came out to listen to us.
Thank you so much, John. That's been brilliant. It's a real great pleasure and privilege talking to you. So thanks very much. And thanks to Noah Community Bookstore as well.
Yes, thanks so much to both of you, Keith and John. This was a really fascinating conversation. And thanks to the audience for such excellent questions. Those of you at home, also, please do remember to get a copy of The Shock from our website, communitybookstore.net. And we hope you'll join us again for another virtual event at Community soon. So thank you, everyone, and have really a great evening. Take care.